Good morning. Good morning. Today we are talking about protein. So, before I jump into protein, I think it's important to remember the context from which I am teaching you. So, my background, right? I own a gym where people resistance train. I'm a wannabe powerlifter where I work out 3, 4 times a week. Um, Given that background, I am probably going to be more adamant about protein's role in muscle function, muscle building, in protein's role in recovery than your average person, your average professor. I do think protein is incredibly important, and I think in my anecdotal experiences working with people that it is definitely not well understood, or I should just say it's not implemented well. So, this is just the overview of the topics. Um, you guys will be going over 5.7 on your own, which is supplementation. And you guys are going to have to take a look at some supplements at the end of this chapter. So, in my mind, right, the way I present this is nothing in the world of sports and resistance training is justified lacking sufficient protein supplementation. Now, you could make this argument for sure about carbohydrates and fat. We obviously need appropriate amounts of carbohydrates for energy, or do we? Or do we? We actually might not. But in my mind, I think if you're trying to be this high level athlete, there needs to be some sort of muscle development to produce force. If you're resistance training and you're going for a physique look and trying to appear more toned, whether you're male or female, right? That toned look is very simply adding more muscle and decreasing body fat, right? So if you're trying to add muscle and getting that toned or muscular look, right, you need to have sufficient amounts of protein. So that's the general basis from which you guys should view this chapter. So just like the last chapter on carbohydrates, let's talk about structure, right? So proteins are built up of amino acids, which is the basic structural component, right? And this is their chemical or elemental constituents are carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The last one, nitrogen, is your differentiating element, right? So carbohydrates, as we discussed last week, is CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Fat, CHO, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Nitrogen is the differentiating element between the other two macronutrients. Proteins are composed of an amino group and a carboxyl group. Depending on their peptide bond formation, this will dictate function, which we'll talk about a little bit later. There are 20 amino acids, which can be broken down into two groups, 9 of them being essential. Essential means we must get them from food. 11 is non-essential, right? Meaning we can manufacture them in the body. Now, the book uses the terms dispensable and indispensable. I've probably read 4 or 5 nutrition texts in addition to, standard exercise physiology texts as well. And I don't know if I've ever seen dispensable and indispensable. Most often you will see essential and non-essential. So essential means you have to get it from food. So I'm going to use those terms instead of what the book uses. As always, sometimes I'll see quotes that I just find interesting and I want to talk about for a second. And one was, in the US, few healthy adults are at risk for amino acid deficiencies. So it depends on the context from which they are proposing this. What is a deficiency, right? Maybe if we're talking about actual metabolic health and metabolic function, sure, we can probably function really well off 30 grams of protein, 40, 50 grams of protein. But in my experience, and I can say this with a great degree of confidence, the vast majority of people are not getting enough protein, and if they're not getting enough protein, they're not getting enough amino acids. So I think to an extent, this sentence from the text is somewhat misleading. Hey, Robert. I'm in the middle of teaching. All right, so protein quality. There's a few ways to look at protein quality. You can look at it first from an amino acid profile. So first we have a complete protein, which would be a full panel, a full array of amino acids. So I said there's 20 amino acids. This means a complete protein would have all 20. Conversely, an incomplete would be missing some, right? So complete and incomplete proteins. And this is where you start to get into some problems with certain vegan or vegetarian diets, where a lot of the foods on those diets, short of soy, are not complete proteins, which we'll talk about later. Next is biological value, where it's this scoring system which represents the amount of protein that's actually absorbed. Lastly, this is probably the most common within the research community, and it's called your protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, right? A little long, but it's based, they come up with this score from 0 to 1.0, and it's based on absorption, utilization, and the amino acid profile being complete or incomplete. So it's a combination, in a sense, of protein quality and biological value. I already said it's from 0 to 1.0. You guys will see over here on this next slide. This is an example of some of the scores found in some protein sources. So you guys can see that whey protein has essentially the highest score across the board. Casein protein, the biological value is a little bit lower, which means it's not absorbed as readily as whey protein. But you can see that soy protein and wheat protein have a lower digestibility score, a lower biological value. So what does this mean, right? This means, and there's, researchers have talked about this, if you're getting the majority of your sources from soy, 1 gram of protein of whey is probably going to be superior than 1 gram of protein of soy, even though soy is a complete protein. Right? Soy does have all 20 amino acids, right? The problem is we might not utilize and absorb all of soy. So if you have 1 gram of whey, you might want to have the equivalent of about maybe 1.3 grams of soy. That's something to think about. Okay? And conversely, in agreement, you could see wheat gluten is very low across the board. Okay, so structure and function, continuing along the theme, well, how do we form these amino acids? They're formed by peptide bonds. So if you have 2 amino acids joined together, you have a dipeptide, all the way up to a polypeptide, which is 4 or more amino acids. Most of our amino acids are in the polypeptide form. So function, amino acids and protein have a wide array of functions in the body, right? First, they help build enzymes, which help speed up chemical reactions. They help produce, they're the basic structure of many hormones. I mean, these are just a few that the book named, but insulin, glucagon, and HGH. We talked about insulin and glucagon last week in terms of the insulinic response from a carbohydrate ingestion. So without sufficient protein and amino acids, we wouldn't have appropriate levels of insulin and glucagon. Structural proteins. So our muscles are actin and our myosin. Those of you that have taken exercise physiology, actin or myosin are the things that help us contract muscle. So if we don't have sufficient protein, we can't build more muscle, which is obviously incredibly important for this class. Transport carriers. So the book talked about hemoglobin, which obviously transports oxygen. Albumin. Albumin helps transports fatty acids, which I think we get into next week when we start discussing fats. So that's incredibly important. And then your immune system, right? So I'll go ahead and use another anecdotal story where I had an athlete. She was a female, And you would argue that she had some sort of issue with food, right? Someone would say at the time some sort of disorder. Again, this is my non-clinical understanding of this, and she had been losing a lot of weight, probably an unhealthy amount of weight. Being something, I don't know, 5'5" in height, and had went from 140 pounds down to under 110, probably like 105 pounds, maybe lighter at her lightest, being 5'5". And I can tell you, again, anecdotally, where is it because she just wasn't having sufficient calories or because she wasn't having sufficient protein? But for a solid year and a half, she was continuously developing some sort of illness or sickness. And again, this is just some sort of story that I'm trying to kind of extrapolate, but it's just something that always comes to the forefront of my mind where if you're not getting sufficient calories and possibly not sufficient protein, it can affect your immune system. And I'll always go back to that story because I remember over the course of a year and a half, I got sick like 5, 6, 7 times. And it was sure enough, she worked on that issue, and that has since changed. But there's just a little story for you guys to kind of remember that. Digestion, absorption, and transportation. So digestion I didn't get into too much. We need to know that amino acids get digested largely in the stomach by hydrochloric acid. So we need to break down the large polypeptide bonds, and hydrochloric acid does that. From there, absorption, just like glucose, takes place largely in the small intestine, right? So we usually require that those amino acids, I already said, need to be broken down by the hydrochloric acid into the tripeptide or smaller type of bonds. What is this here? Sorry. So we get a supply of amino acids from several different sources. One being food, so our exogenous sources, right? The other source is actually from within our body. So we can get amino acids from within our body, and that's our endogenous sources, right? Now, transportation. Once we actually absorb our amino acids through our small intestine, what happens? Well, amino acids can go to one of 3 different places. They can be sent to the liver, right, where they're processed and they go through transamination, deamination, or they can be sent to our skeletal muscle tissue, right, which makes sense because we need them there. But it can also be sent to what we call the amino acid pool. That's why there's a picture of a pool here. So our amino acid pool is essentially our free circulating amino acids within our blood. And we have about, I believe it's 300 grams of free circulating amino acids. Actually, excuse me, 300 grams is turnover. I forget the exact number, but we have a certain amount of amino acids circulating, which can be provided to the muscle if need be. They can go to the liver for the liver to produce other amino acids. So we need this supply circulating in our blood for various functions. A few things to note is that branched chain amino acids, which we'll talk about in a little bit. This is valine, leucine, and isoleucine, right? They cannot really be digested in the liver, right? So your branched chain amino acids are for the most part directed to your skeletal muscle, and your branched chain amino acids are incredibly important when it comes to muscle protein synthesis and upregulating the muscle protein synthesis pathways. So branched chain amino acids, important for muscle protein synthesis. They largely get sent to the skeletal muscle. We need to know that. Last thing is that we're in a constant state of flux. And you guys, if you read the chapter, you would know. It said it probably 4 or 5 times. protein turnover, protein degradation. It's in a constant state of flux. As you are sitting down right now, right, your muscles are being broken down to an extent, your amino acids are being broken down to an extent, whether it's in your liver or muscles, and there's various processes going on constantly. Right, I've already said the liver is one of the major sites of amino acid metabolism, but one thing we haven't really talked about is, well, what is metabolism? What is metabolism? And the most basic definition of metabolism is the summation of anabolism and the summation of catabolism. So anabolism plus catabolism. Anabolic essentially means building up, right? Anabolic steroids builds muscle. Catabolic means breaking down, right? There are various times where we must break down certain things, certain muscle tissues, whether it's to produce energy, whether it is to get more free circulating amino acids to the amino acid pool, right? We will go through various catabolic processes. This is achieved through deamination and transamination. So the liver and the metabolic process in the liver go through both of these processes, where deamination is the removal of amino group, transamination is the removal and the transfer. So within our liver is constantly turning over these amino acids. So it's breaking one amino acid down, removing the amino group, maybe moving another amino acid in, right, and then forming new amino acids. So there's this constant turnover, right? Amino acids are not stored like fat or carbohydrates. Right? I should say carbohydrates because you guys have already discussed carbohydrates at this point. And what do we say happens with carbohydrates? It either gets sent to your skeletal muscle, right, and it's stored as glycogen. It gets sent to the liver, right, and can be stored within the liver also as glycogen. We've got some free circulating blood glucose, but it can also be stored and transferred to adipocytes, right? And amino acids are not like that. Amino acids aren't, and protein is not stored. You either use it or you lose it, right? So you can excrete it, something along those lines. You can use it within your skeletal muscle for muscle protein synthesis, or it could be within your liver, right, for various deamination, transamination processes. This should have been at somewhere towards the beginning. The energetic profile of protein is very similar to carbohydrate, where 1 gram of protein equates to 4 calories of energy. That's just like carbohydrates. So lastly, the question about, is protein, what is a sufficient amount of energy intake for the human person to maximize, let's say, muscle protein synthesis, right? And we need a sufficient intake. Just say there's this fictitious number, whatever it is, 2,000 calories, right? If we go below 2,000 calories, what happens is we start to break down our muscle tissue for energy, right? So if someone goes into some type of starvation diet, right, where they're eating, let's say, 500 calories a day, and maybe 300 is protein and 200 calories or 100 calories is carbohydrates, that's simply not enough carbohydrates for your daily function. So what do we have to do? Whatever muscle our body currently has to be broken down. Okay, so we need sufficient energy to create this protein sparing effect, right? So as long as we're eating enough calories, usually in the form of carbohydrates, that should help spare our muscles from being broken down to be used for energy. Okay. So as I have already alluded to, we can utilize protein for energy, for ATP. This is a very small energy source, right? And it's also inefficient. It's a non-efficient energy source, right? Amino acids, it's actually kind of cool, can enter the Krebs cycle at different points, and this can be seen on page 160. So take a look at it. You can see amino acids can be utilized at various points for energy. So the process that I was alluding to earlier is called proteolysis, right? Remember I said lysis is the breakdown. So the breakdown of protein is proteolysis. And this is upregulated. This process is increase in cortisol. And once cortisol is released, this upregulates leucine oxidation. So what does all this mean? That's why I put this picture here. From a practical application standpoint, people often ask me, should I do my cardio before or after lifting weights? If they choose to do cardio. I'm not sure if that's the best way to go. It really depends on the person. But if they are choosing to do cardio, my answer without hesitation is always after resistance training. So leucine, as I said earlier, is one branched chain amino acid. It is incredibly important, right? Leucine is really the major amino acid which upregulates our mTOR pathway, which upregulates muscle protein synthesis, right? So we need leucine within our muscle to add more muscle. Now, if you were to go out for a jog, right, or maybe even a high intensity workout, right, which increases cortisol, this is going to increase the oxidation of leucine. If we now have less leucine and then go into a resistance training workout, all of a sudden our leucine it's not there. We've just oxidized leucine. So we have a smaller amount of leucine, which means we're going to probably have a smaller muscle protein synthesis effect, right? So this is why I often, pretty much always I should say, if your goal is to maximize muscle hypertrophy, I always tell people that if you're going to do cardio, it should be done after your workout or in a separate session, okay? So we're talking about protein metabolism and that it can be used for energy. So on average, it's largely not used, right? So we got about 3 to 5% of our protein can be utilized for energy. So this is why when we're talking about like using a metabolic carb, which determines how much carbs or fat we're using for energy, we don't talk about protein because it's this 3-4%. It's just not really utilized that much. This can change if you go into extreme bouts of endurance exercise. So we're talking 60 minutes or longer, 90 minutes or longer, 2 hours. When you start to get in that 2-hour range, we can actually start to use up to 15% of our protein intake for energy. Or excuse me, we can use about 15% of our energy comes from protein. Right? So I already stated we're constantly in this protein turnover mode, right? Which means we need to continuously supply our body with protein and amino acids. So the average turnover is 300 grams per day. This is the average person who is not resistance trained, right? So if we're turning it over 300 grams per day, the first question you should probably ask yourself is, well, should I be getting 300 grams of protein a day, right? That's the average person. And then should I be getting 400 grams if I'm working out? Well, the answer is no. The answer is no, because of those 300 grams that are turned over on average per day, 80% are being resynthesized into new proteins. So the majority is actually just being broken down through the transamination and the deamination and just transferred into new proteins. Could they be for skeletal muscle protein? For sure, but it could also be for building some of those transport proteins like albumin and hemoglobin, right? So it's not like 80% all goes to the muscle. It's not how it works, right? And then finally, of the other 20%, that's really broken down and that can be utilized for energy. So we break down the nitrogen component and then we're left with a carbon skeleton, and that carbon skeleton can be utilized for energy. The text then goes into what we talk about is nitrogen balance and muscle protein synthesis. Nitrogen balance is the difference between nitrogen intake, right? Remember, nitrogen is that major differentiating component of protein, and nitrogen loss. So we excrete nitrogen in our urine, right? So you'll see some people, some studies will actually measure nitrogen balance as a correlate of how much protein we are using. Now, just because we're using it doesn't mean it's, like I said, directly going to our muscle. And that's some of the issues with some of these studies that use only nitrogen balance when they're trying to study muscle protein synthesis. Net protein balance is the difference between muscle protein synthesis and muscle protein breakdown. Right? So now when we talk in, again, more practical, is when we go into a resistance training session, right, and we're lifting weights, right, we're curling some weights, doing some bench press, what happens is we're actually breaking down our muscle, okay? So this increases muscle protein breakdown. It isn't until the recovery and the post-workout period, right, the 1 hour, the 4 hour, the 6 hour, the 8 hours post-workout, where we start to increase and upregulate muscle protein synthesis above our muscle protein breakdown rates. So this means we should have a net positive net protein balance in that post-workout window. And this will come into play when we're discussing actual practices, like should we eat protein before or after. You guys will see why this is important. All right, I had to redo this slide because I had to do some math in my head the other time around and it didn't come out nice. So we're talking about the current recommendations, dietary recommendations, and I think this slide is probably the most useful and most practical of all these slides. The current dietary recommendations for your average sedentary person is 0.8 grams per kilogram. This is not for athletes. This is just for somebody sedentary. So for some of us Americans, they're like, well, what does that mean? So I did the math really quickly. For something like a 150-pound person, right, 150-pound person, that's approximately 68, 69 kilograms. That would only come out to about 55 grams of protein, which is incredibly low, incredibly low. And again, you got to remember the context and my background. I've never, ever recommended anyone to have really below 100 grams of protein. So super low. So our protein requirements are really dictated by a lot of things. Why is that low? Male, female, right? The amount of muscle we have, age, the timing of the intake. Are we supplementing with carbohydrates, which may affect that? The quality of their protein, which I alluded to earlier. And then most importantly, our activity level and the type of activity. So endurance athletes in general usually have lower requirements for protein, right? That's 1.2 to 1.4 grams. Resistance trained athletes on average are recommended something in the neighborhood of 1.4 to 1.8 grams per kilogram. And I will go ahead and say that for higher level resistance trained athletes or athletes who partake in sports 6 days a week at a fairly high intensity level, this number probably could go up to in the neighborhood of 2 to 2.5 grams per kilogram. This is also under the consensus that we're operating at a caloric surplus or caloric balance. Our protein requirements go up as we enter a caloric deficit. Okay, so all of these numbers, what do they mean? And again, I try to be as practical as possible. What I typically tell all of my clients, if you resistance train 3 times per week or more at a fairly high level where you're sweating, you're working hard, you're doing compound lifts, right? I typically tell everyone, shoot for a gram per pound. That is what you should shoot for. The gram per pound recommendation, I think, equates to about 2.1 grams per kilogram. So it's definitely on the high end range. But it just makes more sense, where they don't have to think about any computations. They don't have to think about, well, on my off day, should I have less protein? I just tell them, shoot for a gram per pound. If you're slightly off, no big deal, right? So me, 175 pound male, I shoot for approximately 170 grams of protein, more if I'm dieting. So how do we get this, right? Or where do we put this in, this protein, right? Well, we want approximately 25 to 35 grams per meal, and I think this is where a lot of people struggle, right? If you miss a meal, right, and you're shooting for 150 grams of protein, it's going to be really hard to make that up. So like your average college student, they probably wake up, they probably don't have breakfast. You wake up, I don't know, 10, 11 o'clock after eating your last meal at, let's say, 9 p.m. So you go 9 p.m., you wake up around 10 a.m., you're already at 13 hours. Let's say you skip breakfast or you don't have a major protein source, because most don't. You might not get your next major protein source until like 2, 3, 4 p.m. or maybe just dinner, right? So a lot of you college students need to start thinking, oh, I need to get 25 grams of protein, at least 25, 4 to 5 times per day. How do I do that? Right? That's the way you should start thinking if you're working out. Next thing, let's talk about the anabolic window, nutrient timing. The literature largely supports this quote unquote anabolic window. When we go into a hard workout or resistance train with heavy weights, right, our body upregulates our ability to create new muscle. And during this process, we're going to need a large amount of amino acids. That's why we need to supplement. This window is approximately from from minute 0 when you finish the workout to about 2 hours post-workout. This will help reverse the breakdown of muscle and promote more building of the muscle. Of particular importance are branched chain amino acids, leucine, valine, isoleucine. Leucine is incredibly important. So if you are going to buy some sort of protein powder, make sure it tells you the exact amount of BCAAs in it. Some protein powders just say, oh, we have BCAAs. I do like the protein powders that list the exact amounts, right? And our threshold, we should try to achieve at least 3 grams of leucine, right? So if I look at mine right now, right, this has essentially, I think 2.6, but I always take 2 scoops. So this has 2.6. That'll get me to that 3 gram threshold for sure. Also in that post-workout window, carbohydrate consumption does appear to enhance muscle protein synthesis to a small extent. So basically have a protein and a carb post-workout. What is the proposed mechanism behind this? Apparently insulin actually helps amino acid uptake in the skeletal muscle. So think just like glucose, right? When you would have a carbohydrate source, it increases insulin, which increases the transporter hormone GLUT4, which helps promote glucose to enter the skeletal muscle. Insulin also upregulates amino acid uptake into the skeletal muscle through different transporter hormones. They don't use GLUT4. Peri-workout nutrition. Peri-workout simply means during your workout. There's conflicting research out there. But what you would do is you wouldn't drink like a protein shake during your workout because it's kind of gross. You don't want to drink milk while you're doing like 10 sets of 10 on bench press, right? What some people do is they might have something with branched chain amino acids, which is like has like a sweet flavor to it. The research is conflicting, but what does it really do? We can possibly prevent the breakdown of muscle protein. And if we have less catabolism taking place, our total net protein balance is going to be more positive. I don't usually recommend it, but I'm not against it either. Right? And then pre-workout, protein supplementation pre-workout doesn't really appear to enhance muscle protein synthesis. Additionally, like protein pre-workout might slow the absorption of carbohydrates if you're trying to get that to your skeletal muscle. So I wouldn't really recommend taking any sort of protein in that immediate like 60 to 90 minute window pre-workout or 60 to 120 minute window. Too much protein. Is it possible to have too much protein? In theory, there's a lot of reasons for us to not intake too much protein. So the major one that you'll often hear is liver or kidney dysfunction. As we're processing amino acids in the liver, ammonia is a byproduct, And what happens with ammonia? That's going to increase our blood pH. Sometimes our muscles can't contract in the appropriate environment if our blood isn't at the appropriate pH. In addition, having too much protein can dehydrate us, where more water is required for the metabolism of protein. Additionally, you're going to excrete more water in your urine. And then additionally, lastly, which seems to make sense, if you're having more protein, you're probably going to have less carbohydrates. And if you have less carbohydrates, that might negatively affect performance in sports, because we need carbohydrates for energy, because that's a much more readily available energy source. So with all of these theoretical propositions that do seem to make sense on the surface, it does appear that all of them are largely unsupported by the literature. And through a lot of research studies, having these upper limits of protein appear to be very safe. There have been some research studies, one that I know of, which supplemented 4 grams per kilogram, which is an insane amount. It's a lot of protein that no one would ever really eat. So the standard recommendation of 1 gram per pound definitely falls on the upper end of the spectrum. I think it equates to about 2.1 or 2.0 grams per kilo. But none of it seems to have any negative effect on kidney or ammonia levels in the body, right? So I wouldn't, it's what I use, and I think you guys are perfectly fine using that as a guideline for resistance trained athletes or athletes that train 5 or 6 days a week. And I should throw that caveat out there as well. If you're talking about a soccer, basketball player, lacrosse player, and they're doing, repeated sprints in practice, they're going to go through a high amount of muscle protein turnover, right? So they still need to supplement on that higher end range, like 1.6, 1.8 grams per kilo. So, 1 gram per pound, is that a little high? Probably not. I think that's what I would use even if they weren't resistance training. Like I said, that's what I stick with. So just a few things to wrap this up. Just some basic, understanding of what's a vegetarian and a vegan. So a vegetarian is someone who does not consume meat, fish, and poultry. A vegan is someone who does not consume any animal products, including meat, fish, poultry, but in addition, like eggs, milk, cheese, basically any dairy. So if you guys have had me for research methods, you guys would know we watch the Game Changers documentary where they talk about vegan diets being like this super diet which makes you the best athlete in the world, which again, in my opinion, is probably not true. But I do think a vegan diet is perfectly fine. The problem with a vegan diet is you have to go a little bit more out of your way to make sure you achieve appropriate protein supplementation. So the problem, like I said earlier, is that not only is it incomplete, but there's some digestibility concerns with some proteins. So as a vegan, you're going to have to focus more on complementary proteins, which is essentially adding 2 incomplete proteins that achieve a complete amino acid profile. So a common example of this is something like rice and beans. Okay, so again, you can get all the protein you need on a vegan diet. You just have to work a little bit harder. I'm a lazy person. I would probably not want to do that. But hey, if that's what you want to do and you have certain beliefs, rock on. Last thing just to talk about is just supplements. So standard whey protein that I showed earlier, casein protein, it's composed of processed milk. An isolate variation of this removes the lactose component. So if people are lactose intolerant, listen, there's all sorts of degrees of lactose intolerance. It removes the majority of the lactose. If somebody comes to you and say they have a severe lactose allergy, don't tell them to go get whey isolate, right? Because there is some lactose in it. I think even in the book it talked about it removes about 90%. Right, but if they have just some small issues with lactose, they can try isolate and see if that helps. Whey protein, I think, is very beneficial because can you get protein from your diet and all your protein? Absolutely. But I think if you're trying to hit the recommendation of like 1 gram per pound, so for like a 140-pound female, right? If a 140-pound female is trying to get that in a day, there's times where it's just hard, where maybe you missed a major protein source in the morning. If you miss a protein source in the morning, right, that's going to kind of set you back. The only way to quickly get a protein source is whey supplementation, and I think that it just helps you hit your target for the day much easier than food sources. I think both sources are perfectly fine, and there's no issues with going predominantly food. Or if somebody wanted to get 100 grams with whey, that might be a little bit tough, but they can do that as well. Supplements. So I'm not going to really talk about these supplements. That's your job. So part of your assignment for your chapter questions is going to be create a fictitious athlete that may benefit from the use of a supplement. You guys are going to give them a background, right? This doesn't need to be long. It could be 1 to 2 paragraphs. Age, sport, height, weight, level in the sport. Are they a beginner or are they advanced? And give a recommended dosage, right? How many grams per pound? Is it a relative amount? And then finally, why might that help them in their sport? So you can use any of the supplements or the amino acids listed at the back of this chapter. That is it for today.